The most damning verdict ever written about the P-51 Mustang was not written by an American. It was written by the enemy. By the man Berlin sent to find it. A young man walks across the concrete. 21 years old. Bavarian. His name is Walter Wolfram. Behind him, the propellers of Messerschmitt 109s idle in the summer heat. Ahead of him, alone on the tarmac, sits an aircraft that does not belong here. Its underside is painted bright yellow. Its wings carry black crosses. And its silhouette, slim, long-nosed, aerodynamically clean in a way German fighters have never quite achieved, is unmistakable to any pilot who has fought over the Reich in the last 3 months. It is a North American P-51B Mustang. Serial number 43 to 24825. The Americans called it Jerry. The Germans call it T9 plus HK. Wolfram has 100 aerial victories. He has been shot down. He has been wounded 4 times. He has been forced out of the sky more times than any pilot his age should have survived. His right hand carries scar tissue that healed badly in a Crimean field hospital. Nothing about him is theatrical. Nothing about him is uncertain. He climbs onto the wing. He slides open the canopy. He lowers himself into the cockpit of the machine that has been killing Germany's best pilots faster than anyone in Berlin will admit publicly. And what he is about to feel in the next several hours will move up the chain of command. It will land on the desks of generals. And when it reaches them, the reaction will not be tactical. It will not be strategic. It will be silence. To understand what Walter Wolfram found in that cockpit, and why 3 words in his report finished something that had been slowly ending for over a year, we have to go back. Not to the Mustang. Not to the war. We have to go back to a moment when Germany's commanders looked at the sky over Europe, saw an American disaster unfolding in real time, and drew exactly the wrong conclusion. The year is 1943. The United States Army Air Forces is being cut to pieces above the Reich. Picture the interior of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 27,000 feet. The outside temperature is 50 degrees below zero. The heaters work when they feel like it. Oxygen masks freeze. Electric gloves short out. Machine guns jam, because the lubricant turns to paste. Your mission is simple. Fly 600 miles into Germany. Drop your bombs. Fly home. Simple is not the same as survivable. Between the English coast and your target sit the Focke-Wulf 190s and the Messerschmitt 109s of the Luftwaffe. And they are not scrambling in panic. They are not rushing to intercept. They are waiting. With the patience of men who have measured the enemy's fuel down to the kilometer. American escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, can protect the bomber stream as far as the German border. Roughly 250 miles from England. Then they turn back. The Luftwaffe knows exactly where that line is. Their fighter groups are positioned just beyond it. Out of reach. Fresh. Waiting. August 17, 1943. A Tuesday. The 8th Air Force launches its most ambitious operation to date. 376 B-17s in 2 great streams. One aimed at the Messerschmitt production complex at Regensburg. The other at the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The theory is elegant. Every tank, every artillery piece, every aircraft engine, every submarine motor turns on bearings. Destroy the bearings. Seize the machine. Choke Germany's industrial output at a single geometric point. The theory does not survive the day. Elmer Bediner is a navigator in the 379th Bomb Group. His aircraft is called Tondileo. He is one of the men who takes off from an English airfield that morning. He is one of the men who makes it home. He would later write a book about what he saw from the plexiglass nose that afternoon. He described the German fighters pressing in from every angle. He described the sky filling with black smoke, where a bomber had been 30 seconds earlier. He described watching men he had eaten breakfast with fall out of the formation, one at a time. Some on fire, some spinning, some simply gone. He also described something almost impossible to believe. When the ground crews opened Tondeleo's fuel tanks, after the mission, they found 11 20mm shells inside. Fired by German fighters. Lodged in the fuel cells. None of them had exploded. When the shells were later disassembled, they were found to be empty. No explosive charge. Sabotaged somewhere in a factory in occupied Europe, by hands that never signed a name to the record. Bandiner walked away from Schweinfurt in August. And then, on the 14th of October, 1943, he flew it again. They called that one Black Thursday. 291 B-17s took off. 60 were lost outright. Another 17 damaged beyond repair. 650 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured before the formations reached the English coast again. An American bomber crew flew 25 missions to complete a combat tour. On raids like Schweinfurt, the loss rate hit 20%. Do the arithmetic yourself. Over any meaningful number of missions, it is not survivable. Statistically, no crew is supposed to walk away. Bandiner walked away. Most of his friends did not. He wrote later that during those hours, over enemy territory, he had made peace with dying. Not out of despair. Out of arithmetic. And in Berlin, one man looked at those numbers and smiled. His name is Adolf Galland. 32 years old. Cigar smoking. Slick-haired. Confident. Galland reviews the Schweinfurt loss statistics and reaches a conclusion that seems, at the time, entirely reasonable. The Americans cannot sustain this. Unescorted daylight bombing has been proven a failure. The Reich's industrial heartland is beyond the reach of American air power. German fighter production is climbing. The Luftwaffe is winning. And the escort problem, in Galland's professional assessment, is unsolvable. The physics does not permit it. You cannot build a fighter with the range to cross Germany. The tank size required would kill maneuverability. The engine required would drink fuel too fast. The airframe required would be too heavy to climb. It is not a matter of engineering. Their own scientists have run the numbers. A long-range escort fighter capable of dogfighting deep in Germany violates too many trade-offs at once. The situation is, as one Luftwaffe staff paper put it, stable. Remember that word. Stable. It is the single most expensive miscalculation in the history of aerial warfare. Because something is happening in England that German intelligence has seen, that German intelligence has catalogued, that German intelligence has, to a degree historians still find difficult to believe, entirely failed to understand. The aircraft is called the P-51 Mustang. It has existed since 1940. And for most of its early life, it was a disappointment. The Mustang was born from a British request. In 1940, the Royal Air Force asked North American Aviation to build P-40 Warhawks under license. North American proposed instead to design a new aircraft from scratch. Faster. Lighter. Better. They delivered. From contract to prototype in 117 days. It flew beautifully at low altitude. But it had one problem. The engine. The Allison V1710. American-built. Reliable at sea level. And utterly unable to hold its power above 15,000 feet. Above that altitude, the altitude where the war was actually being fought, the Mustang became sluggish. Heavy. Slow. A racing chassis, with a lawnmower engine bolted to the front. The British flew it. The British tested it. The British filed the reports. Conclusion: adequate low-level reconnaissance platform. Unsuitable for combat over Europe. The Mustang, in early 1942, was going nowhere. Then, in the last days of April, that year, an ordinary man had an ordinary idea. His name is Ronald Harker. He is a test pilot. Not military. Civilian. He works for Rolls-Royce, the British aviation engine manufacturer. Practical. Unpretentious. The kind of man you would not notice in a room. On the 30th of April, 1942, Harker is invited to fly a Mustang at the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. He takes it up. He puts it through its paces. He lands. He is impressed by the airframe. He is disappointed by the engine. That evening, he writes a short memorandum to his superiors at Rolls-Royce. Businesslike. He suggests something. He suggests that the Mustang airframe, lean, clean, aerodynamically superior to anything the RAF is currently flying, be married to the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. The same Merlin engine powering the Spitfire Mark 9, two-stage supercharger. Full power at 25,000 feet. The Merlin is heavier. The Merlin is thirstier. The Merlin will require the entire nose of the Mustang to be redesigned. But the Merlin, Harker writes, will make the aircraft into what its airframe has always deserved to be. The memorandum lands on the right desk. Trials begin. British engineers cut open a Mustang and fit a Merlin. American engineers, working from British data, do the same at the North American plant in Inglewood, California. The results, when the modified aircraft flies, are not incremental. They are astonishing. The Merlin-powered Mustang gains roughly 100 miles per hour at altitude. Its ceiling climbs by 10,000 feet. Its rate of climb doubles above 20,000. By the summer of 1943, as Black Thursday is being planned, the redesigned aircraft is entering mass production at North American Aviation. It has been renamed the P-51B. The Allison Mustang was a good aircraft that no one needed. The Merlin Mustang is something else entirely. It has the range to cross Germany. It has the ceiling to fight there. And nobody in Berlin, not Galland, not Göring, not the intelligence staffs at Luftwaffe High Command, yet grasps what has just happened in a factory in California and a workshop in Derby. They still believe the escort line exists. They still believe the situation is stable. They are still positioning their fighter groups just beyond the reach of the P-47s and the P-38s. Waiting for the bombers to come to them. Building tactics on a foundation that has already, without their knowledge, been demolished. They have months, perhaps weeks, before the discovery reaches them. And when it comes, it will not come as a memorandum. It will not come as a strategic assessment. It will not come as a warning. It will come at 360 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet. Over the city of Berlin. Painted in olive drab. Wearing white stars. And when the Reichsmarschall sees them, he will speak one sentence out loud that he will spend the rest of his life trying to take back. But that is part 2. For now, in the summer of 1944, at an airfield deep inside a shrinking Reich, a 21-year-old fighter ace named Walter Wolfram is climbing into the cockpit of the enemy's finest weapon. The canopy slides shut above him. The instrument panel is unfamiliar. The seat sits lower than it should. And somewhere in front of him, a Merlin engine is about to start. Before we return to Walter Wolfram in that cockpit, you need to know how he got there. Because a man does not become the person the Luftwaffe High Command trusts to evaluate its deadliest enemy by accident. He becomes that man one mission at a time. One bad landing at a time. One friend who does not come home at a time. Walter Wolfram was born on the 23rd of May, 1923. A village in Upper Franconia called Schmolz. The son of a Protestant pastor. The second of 4 children. There was nothing exceptional about the boy. He was quiet. Disciplined. He liked things that worked. He liked understanding how things worked. He was 17 years old when he volunteered for the Luftwaffe in October of 1940. By February of 1943, after training on biplanes, then on the Messerschmitt 109F, he was transferred to a fighter wing operating out of the Crimea. The wing was WW2 52. If that name means nothing to you, understand this. In the entire recorded history of aerial combat, every war, every air force, every century, no unit of fighter aircraft has ever accumulated more confirmed kills than WW2 52. The pilots of that wing claimed over 10,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. The three highest scoring fighter aces in the history of aviation all wore its insignia. Erich Hartmann, 352 victories. Gerhard Barkhorn, 301. Gunther Rall, 275. This is the unit a 19-year-old pastor's son joined in the spring of 1943. Nobody expected him to last long. The Eastern Front in 1943 was a furnace. The Soviets had rebuilt, after the catastrophic losses of 1941. The new Yak-9s and Lavochkin La-5s were genuine fighters, capable of standing against the Messerschmitt in the right circumstances. Soviet pilots were getting better. Soviet tactics were sharpening. Soviet aircraft factories, safely beyond the Ural Mountains, were producing airframes at rates the Germans could not match. Every new German pilot who arrived at the front was stepping into a war of attrition that favored whoever had more. More aircraft. More pilots. More fuel. More factories. Wolfram flew his first operational missions over the Kuban bridgehead in March 1943. He did not score his first victory until June. 60 missions of watching, learning, surviving. Some pilots scored on their first flight. Some pilots never scored at all. Wolfram was either. He was methodical. He studied the men he was fighting. He flew carefully enough to stay alive, while the war educated him. By April of 1944, he had 70 victories. Then came the 30th of May, 1944. Over the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. Soviet forces pressing from the north. The German defensive line bending, cracking, holding. Wolfram claimed 11 aerial victories in a single day. Stop and hold that number in your mind. 11 kills. 1 day. 1 pilot. The Luftwaffe had a designation for men who scored 5 or more victories in a single day. They called them ace in a day. It was rare. 10 or more was called double ace in a day, and it was so rare most pilots went their entire careers without seeing it done. Wolfram did it on the 30th of May. Then he did it again. On the 16th of July, 1944, near Kamyanka-Buzka, northeast of Lviv, he claimed 10 more. On the 1st of June, 1944, he was credited with his 100th aerial victory. He was among the small handful of Luftwaffe pilots ever to cross that line. He was 21 years old. He was also, by that summer, one of only a handful of men in the German Air Force whom High Command trusted to look at the enemy honestly and tell them what he saw. Not a staff officer. Not an engineer. A killer. A man who had been shot down. Wounded 4 times. Who had been forced out of the sky more times than the records fully preserve. Who understood in his bones, and not in theory, what separated an airplane that killed from one that got you killed. And there was another man they trusted the same way. Gunther Rall. 26 years old. 3rd highest scoring fighter ace in the history of aviation. 275 victories. Rall had spent nearly the entire war on the Eastern Front. He had been shot down 8 times. In one of those shootdowns, in November of 1941, he had broken his back in 3 places. Doctors told him he would never walk again. He walked again. He flew again. Then, on the 12th of May, 1944, over the Western Front, because by then the Luftwaffe was sending its best men west to try to stop what was coming, Rahl took a burst of 50 caliber fire from a P-47 Thunderbolt. The bullets shattered his left thumb. Field surgeons amputated it. Rahl spent months in recovery. He would not fly combat again until well into 1945. But he could still climb into a cockpit. He could still handle a stick. He could still evaluate an airplane. And in the summer and autumn of 1944, both of these men, Wolfram, still active, still killing on the Eastern Front, and Rahl, grounded, recovering, thinking, were invited to sit inside a captured P-51 Mustang and tell Berlin what they found. Which brings us to the strangest special unit in the entire Luftwaffe. The Wandering Circus. In 1943, a Hauptmann named Theodor Rosarius was given one of the most unusual assignments of the war. His job was to build a flying zoo. He was to collect Allied aircraft that had been forced down or captured, repair them, repaint them, and fly them in front of German pilots, so those pilots could understand what was killing them. The unit was officially designated the 2nd Squadron of the Trials Unit of the Luftwaffe High Command. Nobody called it that. Everyone called it Wanderzirkus Rosarius. The Wandering Circus of Rosarius. A traveling exhibition of enemy machines that toured operational airfields like a grotesque carnival. Look! This is what is hunting you. Now come and touch it. The circus collected everything. P-38 Lightnings. P-47 Thunderbolts. Spitfires. Mosquitoes. Typhoons. B-17s. B-24s. And eventually the prize the Luftwaffe most wanted to understand, the P-51 Mustang. Every captured aircraft was painted, with a distinctive scheme. Bright yellow undersides. Yellow tail. Yellow nose. Because the last thing you wanted was for a German anti-aircraft battery to shoot down what looked exactly like an American fighter over the Reich. Each aircraft carried a special unit code. 2 characters. T and 9. One of the Mustangs the circus flew was serial number 43 to 24825. A P-51 B-15 Na. It had been assigned originally to Lieutenant Thomas E. Fraser of the 4th Fighter Group, 334th Fighter Squadron, based at Debden in Essex, England. Its nickname, painted on the cowling by its original American pilot, was Jerry. Fraser lost the aircraft in combat near Cambrai, France. The date he lost it was the 6th of June, 1944. Look at that date again. The 6th of June, 1944. At the same hour that the American 1st Infantry Division was walking into machine gun fire on Omaha Beach, as the largest amphibious invasion in human history was hitting the sand of Normandy, a young American fighter pilot was force landing his Mustang in a field north of Paris. The Germans recovered the aircraft. They moved it to Rechlin. They repaired it. They repainted it in Luftwaffe markings. They assigned it the code T9 plus HK. By the time all of that was done, weeks had passed. It was no longer June. And by the time the aircraft reached the men who mattered, the men who would fly it and write about it, the summer of 1944 was well underway. Selected pilots, men who had fought the Mustang in combat and survived, were allowed to walk around it on the ground, to sit in its cockpit, to feel the controls, to ask, finally, the question they had been fighting past for months. Why does this thing keep winning? A handful of aces were allowed to fly it. Walter Wolfram was one of those men. He accepted the invitation. He climbed onto the wing. He lowered himself into the cockpit. And the first thing he noticed had nothing to do with speed. Nothing to do with firepower. Nothing to do with altitude performance, or climb rate, or turning radius. The first thing he noticed was space. The cockpit of the P-51 was enormous. After thousands of hours in the Messerschmitt 109, the Mustang's cockpit felt like climbing into a different country. In the 109, a pilot's shoulders pressed against the fuselage walls. The 20mm motor cannon fired through the propeller hub, its breech nested deep between the engine's cylinder banks just ahead of the cockpit. The controls were tight, compressed, shaped around the body like a tailored suit. It had been built to be fast. It had not been built to be comfortable. It had not been built to fly for very long at all. In the P-51, everything was different. The seats sat lower. The instrument panel was wider. The controls felt distant, spread out, easy to reach without contortion. And on the later production Mustangs, the ones with the bubble canopy, a pilot could look behind him, above him, below him, without craning his neck. In the 109, looking behind you meant twisting your body against the harness and hoping. Wolfram described the sensation precisely in the memoir he would later leave for history. Although the P-51 was a fine airplane to fly, because of its reactions and capabilities, it too was disconcerting. A fine airplane. From a man with 100 victories. That phrase was not a compliment. It was a professional verdict, delivered by a killer who had earned the right to render one. But the cockpit was only the opening line of his report. When Wolfram pushed the throttle forward, and the engine came to life, he felt something that shifted, quietly and permanently, his understanding of what an aircraft could be. The engine was a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V16 50-3. Liquid-cooled. 12 cylinders. Approximately 1,400 horsepower at combat rating. And equipped with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained its power at altitudes, where the Daimler-Benz DB605 and the Messerschmitt 109 began to fade. The supercharger engaged automatically. The fuel mixture adjusted itself. The aircraft simply produced what it was supposed to produce, regardless of altitude, regardless of temperature, regardless of whether the pilot was climbing, or diving or turning. But here is the detail that stopped every German pilot who flew it. There were no oil leaks. Take a moment with that. If you have ever worked on a machine that mattered, a tractor, a truck, an aircraft, an engine of any kind, that had to be kept running in weather that did not want it to run, you understand what that means. Wolfram had spent 16 months on the Eastern Front. Russian winters where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. German ground crews working in darkness, before 4 in the morning. Cracked hands? Frozen tools. Cranking the inertia starter flywheel by hand, physically spinning it, until enough energy was stored to turn over the engine. Where oil viscosity was a daily crisis. Where a seal that worked in September failed in December. Where an oil leak at altitude meant a forced landing in Soviet-held territory. And a forced landing in Soviet-held territory, in the winter of 1944, meant one of two outcomes, and neither of them was good. An engine that did not leak oil. An engine that started at the press of an electric button. That was not combat performance data. That was industrial civilization. Gunther Rall, in his own evaluation of the same aircraft, said it more plainly than anyone else did in the entire war. I had a very good impression of the P-51 Mustang. The big difference was the engine. In the P-51, there was no oil leak. And that was just fantastic. I was also very interested in the electrical starting switches, which we did not have. This made it very difficult in starting our engines in the Russian winter. The third highest scoring fighter ace in the history of aviation. Speaking, after the war, about starter motors. He was not talking about dogfighting. He was not talking about gunnery. He was talking about the gap between the factory that built his aircraft and the factory that built the aircraft trying to kill him. American plants were rolling P-51s off the assembly line at rates exceeding 100 per week by early 1944. Each one precision machined. Each one functionally identical to the one before it. Each one built by workers who were not being bombed while they worked. Whose material supplies had not been substituted with inferior alloys. Whose replacement parts were not sitting in a crater outside Regensburg, because a B-17 raid had gone off target the previous night. The Mustang just worked. Every time. And that reliability cascaded through everything. A German pilot, who could not start his engine on a cold morning, spent precious minutes on the ground, while the American formation passed overhead. A German aircraft that developed an oil leak had to break off combat early, or die trying to fly through it. A German ground crew that spent 3 hours fixing what should have been a 30-minute job had one fewer aircraft ready for the next mission. Multiplied across thousands of aircraft. Across hundreds of missions. Across 2 years of steadily worsening industrial conditions in Germany, and steadily improving industrial conditions in America. The gap was not pilot skill. The gap was not aircraft design philosophy. The gap was 2 entire nations. And by 1944, one of those nations had already left the other behind. And there was still one more thing Wolfram found. Something almost invisible. Something the North American engineers themselves had only partially understood when they built it. The wing. The North American engineering team, led by chief designer Edgar Schmud, had built the P-51 with what was called a laminar flow wing. A design developed in cooperation with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA. The airfoil profile was shaped to maintain smooth, orderly airflow over a much greater portion of the wing surface, before turbulence set in. In theory, this could reduce wing drag significantly compared to conventional designs. In practice, the gains were smaller than theory suggested. Rain, insects, manufacturing imperfections, even a scuff on the paint could disrupt the laminar flow. But here is what nobody had fully anticipated. By accident. By engineering serendipity. By the same kind of luck that had brought the Merlin engine to the Mustang airframe. The laminar flow airfoil was also superior at reducing drag at high Mach numbers. The P-51 had what engineers would later describe as a transonic wing. Its critical Mach number, the speed at which compressibility began causing dangerous handling problems, was higher than the Messerschmitt 109s. Higher than the Focke-Wulf 190s. Higher than any other fighter the Luftwaffe faced. In a high-speed dive, when both aircraft were pushing the limits of what their airframes could handle, the P-51 pilot maintained control, while the German pilot felt his controls going stiff. His aircraft buffeting. His elevator losing effectiveness. The German solution to compressibility was to break off early. Lose the engagement. Live to fight another day. The American solution was to keep diving. Keep pulling. Stay in it. You cannot outtrain an advantage baked into the wing. But the wing was not the last of it. There was still one more discovery in Wolfram's report. The one that finally arrived at Luftwaffe High Command like a coroner's finding. Because up in Berlin, by January of 1944, something else had already happened. Something that had almost nothing to do with airplanes. Something that had to do with a single sentence on a wall. At 8th Air Force Fighter Command Headquarters in England, there was a sign hanging, where every officer could see it. It had been there since 1943. It read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." In January of 1944, a new commander arrived to take over the 8th Air Force. His name was Lieutenant General James Harold Doolittle. 47 years old. The same Doolittle who had led the low-level raid on Tokyo in April of 1942, the raid that had told a shattered America, for months after Pearl Harbor, that the war could still be carried to the enemy. Doolittle walked into that headquarters. He read the sign on the wall. He ordered it taken down. A new sign went up in its place. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. He would later call it the single most important decision he made in the entire war. Because with the Merlin-powered Mustang now arriving in numbers, the American fighters no longer had to stay tied to the bombers. They could range 50 miles ahead of the formations. They could sweep the sky clean, before the bombers even arrived. They could hunt. And on the 4th of March, 1944, P-51 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group became the first American fighters ever to reach Berlin. A small formation. A recall order that never got through. A handful of Americans, alone, over the capital of the Reich. 2 days later, on the 6th of March, more than 700 bombers, protected by nearly 800 fighters, hit Berlin in daylight. This time the 4th Fighter Group, Thomas Fraser's group, the same group that would later lose Jerry over Cambrai, was there in force. The Germans called it Black Monday. 69 American bombers were lost. It was, in the raw numbers, an American disaster. But it was also something else. American fighters, real ones, dogfighting ones, Merlin-engined ones, were now flying over Berlin with fuel to spare. When Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, on the ground at Carenhall, received word that American fighters were circling the German capital, he is reported to have said, in an account attributed to him, after the war, one sentence he would spend the rest of his life trying to take back. When I saw the Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. Göring had spent the entire war telling the German public that American factories built refrigerators, not warplanes. He had assured Hitler that the skies over the Reich were impenetrable. And now American fighter pilots were circling his capital at will. With enough fuel left in their tanks to strafe their way home. The escort line was gone. The stable situation was gone. And the Luftwaffe had not yet fully understood what had killed it. But Walter Wolfram, sitting in the cockpit of T9 plus HK on that summer day in 1944, was about to understand. Not through combat. Through fuel. Because when he checked the Mustang's tanks, the internal tanks in the wings, the auxiliary tank behind the pilot's seat, the fittings for the external drop tanks under each wing, he did the arithmetic that every German pilot eventually did, when they realized what they were facing. A Messerschmitt 109G had roughly 90 minutes of fuel. A P-51D, with 2 external drop tanks, could stay in the air for over 7 hours. 90 minutes. Against 7 hours. And in that number, that single, quiet, unglamorous number, Walter Wolfram understood what his report was going to say to Berlin. The Luftwaffe had not been outflown. It had been outendured. By an entire civilization. That was the arithmetic Walter Wolfram carried out of the cockpit of T9 plus HK. He climbed down from the wing. He walked back across the tarmac. And somewhere in the days that followed, he sat down and wrote what he had found. We do not have his report in full. Much of what he saw survives only through his post-war memoir and the recollections of the men who read what he wrote. But we know the shape of it. Because his conclusions matched, almost word for word, what Gunther Rall would say later, and what every other Luftwaffe pilot who flew the Mustang would eventually admit. The Americans had not built a better fighter. They had built a better war. And by the summer Wolfram wrote his report, the war he was describing had already begun to consume the men who trained the men who were supposed to stop it. Because here is the number that finished the Luftwaffe. Not the number of aircraft. The number of hours. By late 1944, a new German fighter pilot arriving at his operational unit had approximately 100 hours of total flight time. Some had less. Some, in the final months, had as few as 70. His American opponent had 400 hours or more. Much of it in aircraft that closely resembled what he would actually fly in combat. Much of it flown under conditions explicitly designed to replicate the sky over Germany. 100 hours means you have learned to take off and land. You have done some aerobatics. You can hold formation. You can, on a good day, hit a stationary target on a gunnery range. You have never been in a real fight. And now, on a morning in October or November, or the freezing dawn of a February day in 1945, you are being told to intercept a formation of 800 B-17s and B-24s, escorted by 900 P-51 Mustangs flown by men who have been flying since before you finished ground school. The result was not combat. It was execution. There is a word for what was happening. Systems analysts would coin it later. They called it a death spiral. The worse your pilot quality, the higher your loss rate. The higher your loss rate, the shorter the training pipeline. The shorter the pipeline, the worse your pilot quality. Around and around. Faster and faster. And nothing in the system could reach in and stop it. The aces, the men who had built the reputations of WW 52 and WW 26 and WW 27, the pilots with 50, 100, 200 victories, those men survived because they had the skill and the judgment and the accumulated instincts of hundreds of engagements. The replacements had none of that. They died in ones and twos on every mission. Sometimes on their first flight. Sometimes without ever seeing the aircraft that killed them. Kurt Bühligen, one of the highest-scoring Luftwaffe aces on the Western Front, with 112 victories, watched the replacements arrive and leave. Many of them, he said later, were dead before they had learned what they were doing wrong. And through all of this, the Mustangs kept coming. More of them every week. Now stop for a moment and think about what that meant. Not just to a pilot. To an entire nation trying to fight a war. Germany, in 1944, actually produced more aircraft than in any previous year of the conflict. Over 35,000 of them. Albert Speer's reforms, the dispersal of production into forests and salt mines and railway tunnels, the use of forced labor, all of it kept the factories running despite everything the 8th Air Force could drop on them. The airframes were there. The pilots were not. You can replace a Messerschmitt in 6 weeks. You cannot replace Walter Wolfram in 6 weeks. You cannot replace Gunther Rahl in 6 weeks. You cannot replace the months of Crimean winters and Ploieschti summers that made those men what they were. The Luftwaffe was not running out of airplanes. It was running out of the human beings who knew how to fly them against Americans. And on the 16th of July, 1944, the same day Walter Wolfram claimed 10 aerial victories in a single sortie northeast of Lviv, the war took him too. Somewhere in that engagement, he was severely wounded. The details of the wound are not extensively documented in the surviving records. What is documented is the outcome. He was pulled out of combat. Hospitalized. Grounded for months. Think about that. The same mission that placed him among the rarest handful of pilots in aviation history, 10 kills in one day, done twice in a single career, also took him out of the war. By the time he was fit to return to a cockpit, the war he came back to was not the war he had left. He resumed operational flying in February of 1945. He took command of the first staffel of WW 52. He was 21 years old, and he had 100 victories, and he had the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross around his neck. He was exactly the kind of pilot the Reich needed. There was almost nothing left of the Reich to need him. The aircraft on the airfields were fully armed, fully airworthy, sitting in their revetments, with belted rounds in their gun bays. There was no fuel to put in the tanks. The oil campaign, the one that Karl Spatz and his staff had pushed through over bitter Royal Air Force objections, the strategic bombing target that nobody had believed in until it started working, was doing exactly what its planners had promised. Synthetic fuel production had collapsed. The Luftwaffe's remaining pilots trained less, flew less, and when they did fly, they flew shorter missions, avoiding combat, hoarding what little aviation gasoline remained. The Eastern Front collapsed. The Western Front collapsed. WW 52, the highest-scoring fighter wing in the history of aviation, spent the last months of the war relocating, from one shrinking airfield to another, chasing whatever strip of concrete was still in German hands, still far enough east to be reached, from a fuel depot that had not yet been overrun. On the 8th of May, 1945, Wolfram's unit was at Deutschbrod, a town in what is now the Czech Republic. Havlik of Brod on the modern map. Germany surrendered. Wolfram and the surviving men of the First Staffel laid down their arms to American soldiers. They believed they were prisoners of the United States Army. They believed, therefore, that they had a future. 3 weeks later, in one of the darker footnotes of the entire European settlement, the American command transferred them to Soviet custody. The Soviets took them. And here is where scar tissue, from an old wound, healed badly in a Crimean field hospital, saved the life it had almost taken. Because when Soviet processing officials examined Walter Wolfram, they classified him as medically compromised, too damaged to be useful, as a laborer in the camps beyond the Urals. His injuries were serious enough that they simply released him. His comrades were not as fortunate. Many of them, men who had flown the same missions, killed the same enemies, worn the same uniform, would spend the next 10 years in Soviet captivity. Some would spend longer. Some would never come home at all. Wolfram walked out of prison relatively quickly. Wounded. Silent. Alive. He was 22 years old, and the war that had defined every day of his adult life was over. The other man in this story, Gunther Rall, the ace with 275 victories, the man who had lost his left thumb to AP-47 in the summer of 1944, was captured by American forces in Bavaria at the end of the war. The Americans did not hand him to the Soviets. Rall was released. He worked in a series of civilian jobs. And then, in 1956, in one of the strange reversals of the post-war order, the new West German Bundesluftwaffe, the Air Force of a democratic republic, the Air Force of a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, invited him back into uniform. He accepted. He rose to lieutenant general. He served as inspector of the German Air Force, from 1971 to 1974. He retired as the Federal Republic of Germany's military representative. He was 91 years old. And in the years before he died, he spoke openly, to historians, to interviewers, to an American Air Force officer, who befriended him, about what he had found in the cockpit of that captured Mustang. He never performed false modesty. He never pretended his enemy had been anything less than what his enemy had been. He simply said what he had seen. I think the best airplane was the P-51. Certainly the Spitfire was excellent. But it didn't have the endurance of the P-51. I think this was the decisive factor. They flew for 7 hours, and we flew for 1 hour and 20 minutes. That makes quite a difference in aerial combat. From a man with 275 aerial victories. From the third highest scoring fighter ace in the history of aviation. His final verdict on what had won the air war. Endurance. Not genius. Not heroism. Not even aircraft performance in the narrow technical sense. Endurance. The ability to keep coming. The ability to arrive over Berlin with fuel to spare. The ability to still be fighting when the German pilot had long since turned for home. The ability to fly 1,100 miles and be ready to fight at the end of it. And Walter Wolfram. Wolfram could not stay away from the sky. The war had wounded him 4 times. It had shot him down. It had put him in a Soviet processing camp. It had killed most of the men he had learned to fly with. And still, when it was all over, he went back to the air. Not for a nation. Not for an ideology. Not for a uniform. For itself. He became a competitive aerobatics pilot. A man who had spent his early 20s fighting for his life at 20,000 feet, now flying purely for the pull of a tight turn, the sound of a piston engine at full power, the feeling of a wing that answers. He won the German National Aerobatics Championship in 1962. He placed second in 1961, 1963, 1964, and 1966. He lived long enough to see propeller fighters replaced by jets, and jets replaced by missiles, and the sky he had fought and reshaped by the Cold War his generation had left behind. Walter Wolfram died on the 26th of August, 2010, in Schwabach. He was 87 years old. Somewhere in the archives, his report survives. Precise. Professional. Written in the plain language of a fighter pilot, who had earned every credential required to render a professional judgment on the machine that had ended his war. A fine airplane. 3 words. From a man with 100 victories. That was what shocked his superiors. Not the details. Not the performance data. Not the wing profile, or the electric starter, or the 7 hours of fuel. The conclusion. Because a fine airplane, from Walter Wolfram, did not mean an aircraft we can fight. It did not mean an aircraft with exploitable weaknesses. It did not mean a target. It meant we cannot match this. Not the aircraft. Not what it represented. Not the country that had built it. The Luftwaffe did not lose, because German pilots ran out of courage. By the testimony of the men who fought them, American, British, Soviet, all of them, German fighter pilots were among the finest professionals in the history of aviation. The system that produced Wolfram, and Roll and Hartmann, and Barkhorn was a genuinely extraordinary machine, forged in combat, and refined by experience, that no peacetime training could replicate. The Luftwaffe lost, because the P-51 changed the fundamental economics of the air war. Before the Mustang, Schweinfurt had proved that unescorted bombing was mathematically unsurvivable. The Luftwaffe's strategy of waiting beyond the escort line was working. Given time, it might have forced the 8th Air Force to abandon daylight bombing entirely. The Mustang made that calculation obsolete in a matter of months. It erased the escort line. It made the Reich's industrial heartland reachable on any clear day. It gave Doolittle's fighters permission to hunt instead of guard. And because American factories built them by the hundred every week, the supply was, for practical purposes, inexhaustible. Wolfram's report confirmed all of it. Not in production statistics. Not in strategic analysis. In the language of what a fighter pilot feels in a cockpit, when he pushes the throttle forward, and the aircraft does what it is supposed to do. Every time. Without complaint. A fine airplane. There are men watching this, or listening to this, whose fathers flew those Mustangs. Whose fathers rode inside those B-17s. Whose fathers wrenched on those engines in the cold of an English morning in 1944, or waited on a runway in the Aleutians, or came home, with pieces of metal still inside them, that the doctors could not safely remove. Those men are almost all gone now. The pilots of Jägerschwader 52 are gone. Most of the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group are gone. Walter Wolfram is gone. Gunther Roll is gone. What is left is the record. The reports they filed. The memoirs they wrote. The interviews they gave, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes at the end of long lives, when there was no longer any reason to be anything but honest. And what that record says when you read it carefully, when you strip away the flags, and the newsreels, and the comfortable stories, is something simple. Wars are decided by systems. By production. By logistics. By the quiet miracle of an engine that starts in the cold. But those systems are operated by men who had names. Who had families. Who had scars that healed badly, and hands that never quite worked the same way afterward. Walter Wolfram climbed into the cockpit of the enemy's finest weapon. He felt what it could do, and he told the truth about what he found. That was the end of the air war over Europe. Not in a battle. Not in a headline. In a report. Written by a 21-year-old pastor's son, from a village in Upper Franconia. Who had, by then, seen everything.